Hello and welcome back. In the previous lecture, we discussed how the Southern economy changed and expanded its impact on slavery. In addition, we saw that the South became increasingly fearful of the North's growing economic and political power. As a result, the South defended their social institutions more intensely as the 19th century unfolded. We finished the lecture by stressing that slavery should be understood as a central part of Southern culture. Abolishing slavery was not just an end of a labor system, it meant a fundamental transformation of the Southern way of life. Today, our last lecture of the term, we will look at four main topics: slave compromises, re-enlightenment of political parties, death of slavery, and Reconstruction. So let's get started. As noted in an earlier lecture, the Constitution was a document built on a wide range of compromises. These included the nature of republicanism, the relationship of state versus federal political power, and whether slavery was legal. When the country enlarged its territories and the South was revived by cotton production, the nation was pushed to negotiate the issue of slavery once again. In a previous lecture, we covered the Missouri Compromise. As noted there, this compromise sought to settle the slave issue in the new land acquired from France in 1803. It also sought to balance political power between North and South. Missouri entered the Union as a slave state, but slavery was not allowed in any other northern territory. To balance political power in the Senate, Maine entered as a free state. When the U.S. gained the Oregon Territory from England and took land from Mexico as a result of war, the slave issue arose once again. The 1850 Compromise was government's attempt to negotiate slavery, but instead of resolving issues, problems intensified. This compromise was a package of 5 bills passed by Congress in 1850. This included acceptance of California as a free state, Texas giving up claims to some of their western land, organization of New Mexico and Utah into territories, banning the slave trade in the District of Columbia, and the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act was the key source of tension. This law meant to ease Southern frustrations over runaway slaves. In the years leading up to 1850, there was an increased number of slaves running away and finding refuge in the North. The law required judicial officials in all states and territories to help Southerners reclaim their runaway property. In addition, Southerners could legally pursue and claim slaves anywhere. Where the law was meant to lower tensions, its effect was the opposite. Southerners became angry when Northerners resisted the law. And Northerners became angry when Southerners marched through their farms and ranches searching out their runaways. Instead of easing tensions, frustrations grew. If the Fugitive Slave Act had the result of intensifying frustrations and anger between North and South, popular sovereignty resulted in bloody conflict. The direct cause of conflict was the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This law tried to apply the ideas behind popular sovereignty, which said that the people living in an area should make fundamental decisions for themselves. In broad terms, the idea was appealing, but most politicians that promoted it were trying to undercut agreements made under the Missouri Compromise. In 1854, Kansas and Nebraska were still territories. The Constitution gave states a great deal of authority in governing themselves, but territories were the direct responsibility of the federal government. Nevertheless, under the Kansas-Nebraska Act, these territories were told that they could choose whether they would allow slavery or not. As a result, Northerners and Southerners sought to get as many people from their side to move into these territories to support their cause. Pro- and anti-slavery forces developed and gun battles broke out. Fighting continued in these territories all the way through the Civil War. Events in these territories showed conflicts over slavery were overtaking the ability of the federal government to control. In the years leading up to the Civil War, states in the North began to write laws seeking to nullify the Fugitive Slave Act, and Southern states began to develop organized militias. The breakdown of the political system was to intensify as the old political parties fragmented. The failure of compromise showed the weakness of the old political system and opened the door to new political parties and the realignment of the Democratic Party. The Whig Party collapsed in the 1850s. A number of new parties appeared. One that had a strong following was known as the Know Nothing Party. It got its name because they were secretive. Often they were asked about their positions, and their response was that they knew nothing. Their actual name was the American Party. Their main goal was to stop immigration and protect what they considered to be the traditional American values. The image on the screen has a heading that reads Uncle Sam's Youngest Son, and is meant to depict what an American young man should look like. A second party that grew out of the collapse of the Whigs is the Republican Party. Their platform focused on improving economic affairs. To do this, they favored giving land grants to people moving into Western territories. They also wanted to impose import tariffs or taxes to protect U.S. industries. Along with these new parties, the Democratic Party became polarized between North and South. Northern Democrats were supported by immigrants, the biggest contingent being Irish. They opposed efforts for immigration reforms promoted by the Know-Nothings. They were against the spread of slavery on economic grounds, but they did not support abolitionists who sought to free slaves. Among Northern Democrats, there was a strong anti-black contingent. Southern Democrats sought to defend slavery as a cultural and economic institution. They sought to overturn limitations on slavery. They also were against tariffs because they felt England would respond with their own tariffs, which would reduce profits in cotton trade. The election of 1860 showed the political fissures that resulted from the splintering of political parties. Looking at this map, we see that Lincoln won the election with under 40% of the popular vote. The Democratic Party won over 300,000 more votes than Lincoln, but it was split between Northern and Southern Democrats. The electoral votes are among the oddities of the election. In it we see that the Constitutional Party, which had some old-time Whigs joining with Know-Nothings, won 3 times more electoral votes than Northern Democrats, even though they had less than half of the popular vote. The result of political fragmentation is that Lincoln became president, although a large majority of the country opposed him. Southerners were shocked by the outcome. On one hand, they realized that in political terms, they would always be overwhelmed by the North. On the other hand, since Lincoln had such a weak showing, many Southerners were emboldened in their belief that he was not strong enough, either personally or politically, to block them from breaking away and starting their own confederacy. Secession, meaning states leaving the Union, was only weeks away, and the Civil War would follow shortly thereafter, with a Confederate attack on Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861. Military events of the Civil War are too numerous for us to cover in this lecture. Instead, we will focus here on steps directly related to the end of slavery. To begin, we need to recognize that although the South was largely unified in their support of slavery and hatred of Lincoln, they were not unified in secession or the Civil War. This map depicts the range of votes regarding secession. In it, we see that the border states did not secede. We also see significant opposition to secession in most states that did secede. Lincoln was aware of these splits, and they played into many decisions he made, especially regarding the Emancipation Proclamation. It was a wartime measure, so it did not need congressional approval. It proclaimed the freedom of slaves in the 10 states that were in rebellion and allowed former slaves to enlist in the Union military. But it did not apply to slavery in states that were not in rebellion or in Washington, D.C. It is important to know that slavery was legal under the Constitution. This helps explain why the proclamation did not apply to the states that were not in rebellion. But it also brings up a legal question. Will the wartime proclamation remain in force after the war? From Lincoln's perspective, the proclamation put in place a movement toward the constitutional end of slavery. Slavery legally ended with the adoption of the 13th Amendment. The amendment won approval in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, and was swiftly ratified by the states. But only Union states were allowed to vote. Although the institution of slavery ended, this amendment did not speak to the treatment of former slaves. Issues related to protection of freedmen, the name used for former slaves, had to wait for further action. Reconstruction refers to the time period between 1865 and 1877 when the United States sought to rebuild the country. This was an intense political, legal, and social challenge. Andrew Johnson and Thaddeus Stevens represented diametrically opposed positions on these issues. Johnson became president after Lincoln was assassinated in April of 1865. He was a Southern Democrat from Tennessee who strongly opposed secession of the South. Lincoln had chosen him as vice president for a second term in office as a demonstration to the South that their interests would be represented. Johnson came from a working-class background, and although he was elected to the Senate, he had a lifelong dislike of Southern aristocrats. He blamed them for the Civil War. Although he hated upper-class Southerners, he was no friend of the slave. He had owned a small number of slaves, but more importantly, he feared that the end of slavery would end up punishing the working-class white population. Johnson's actions as president are best understood as a defense of working-class white interests in the South. He tried to block integration of the freedmen into society because he saw them competing with poor whites of the South. The Civil War ended on April 9, 1865, when General Lee surrendered to General Grant in North Virginia. In the summer of 1865, Congress was not in session, so Johnson had almost complete authority to decide Reconstruction issues. This period is referred to as Presidential Reconstruction. Generally speaking, Johnson tried to bring the South back into the Union as quickly as possible. In addition, he sought to maintain the social, economic, and political positions of freedmen as close to slavery as possible. He granted amnesty and pardoned most of the white Southerners. He restored property rights with the exception of slaves, as long as they pledged their loyalty to the Union. His actions were seen as outrageous by most Northerners who wanted to punish Southerners for the slaughter of war. But nothing could be done until Congress returned to session. Thaddeus Stevens was a congressional representative from Pennsylvania. He had been an avowed abolitionist before the war and promoted radical civil rights for former slaves. He wanted to fully include freedmen as citizens. His views were seen as radical with little popular support. But the actions of President Johnson pushed moderate congressional representatives into his camp. By 1866, the radical wing of the Republican Party won a majority in Congress, which led to an era referred to as Congressional Reconstruction. We'll cover four main issues here. The first is the Reconstruction Act passed by Congress in 1867 over the veto of President Johnson. It divided the South into 5 military districts governed by Union generals. Military administrators oversaw the writing of new constitutions. All men, regardless of race, were allowed to participate in constitutional conventions. And Southern states were also required to ratify the 14th Amendment. At the conclusion of this process, they could regain their full status as self-governing states. The second part of Congressional Reconstruction was the 14th Amendment that was passed in 1868. This amendment gave national citizenship to all people born or naturalized in the U.S. regardless of race. The third part was the 15th Amendment, passed in 1870. This gave voting rights to all men, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Women's rights advocates strongly opposed this amendment because it did not include them. The fourth part was the Civil Rights Act of 1875. This outlawed racial discrimination in theaters, hotels, railroads, and other public places. Congressional Reconstruction was idealistic, but following through on its promises proved difficult. Passage of amendments and laws were pushed by the radical wing of the Republican Party. They took control of Congress partly as a result of the actions of Andrew Johnson, but most of the nation was uneasy with fundamental social change. The image on the screen provides a picture of how many in the North viewed Reconstruction. In addition, Congressional Reconstruction was costly. Federal troops were needed to administer and implement freedmen's rights. Many soldiers died trying to enforce laws on white Southerners who rejected Union rule. As a result, in 1877, the federal government declared Reconstruction to be complete. But in practice, this meant that Black communities were now on their own to defend their rights. This proved to be extremely difficult, especially with the appearance of the Ku Klux Klan, which sought to return the South to the cultural norms that existed before the Civil War. Okay, let's end our lecture here. See you in class.